Hey everybody, it's Jim Fossil, weekly columnist of the Portland Press Herald, Maine Sunday Telegram. I also now have a Substack, and I'll put links to both in the comments below. I didn't plan on doing another one of these right away, but when the president goes out to your governor and you have a good friend from back in college, well, former professor from back in college who's an expert on the balance of powers, it's a good time to chat about it and do it again right away. So tonight I have Professor Andrew Rudalevige from Bowdoin College, who was also my professor at Dickinson College, way back in the dark ages. When Drew Bledsoe was still the Patriots quarterback. So it's kind of odd, Professor Rudalevige, that Trump decided to go after Mills on this, and most Democratic states are doing the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think it's varied so far. I mean, different laws vary against the different states. What's been adopted in this area over time, obviously, is what's governing now. And of course, the Biden administration had a very different view of how different laws ought to be implemented. So I think, prior to this, prior to January, right, most states to be in line with what they were being told to do by the federal government would have had Maine's position on this issue.
Right. But my point was that there are other states led by Democratic governors that are pretty much behaving the same way that Maine is now.
Yeah, well, I think that it was clearly in the president's mind, because of the, sort of within the week before, you had, members of the Maine legislature sort of trumpeting this issue. And, I think probably that probably got into the news feed of the White House somehow, Rep. Libby et al., sort of making this an issue. And I assume that's why Maine was in his mind, because he sort of, called out Governor Mills specifically, at that governor's meeting. So just randomly, hey, is the governor of Maine here?
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
looking to pick a little bit of a fight there, I think.
Yeah, and like I said, I thought it was interesting that he picked on her instead of, say, Gavin Newsom or one of the governors of other states, the swing states that he won. We're probably approaching it in about the same way so far.
I would think they are. Yeah, I think again, I think it was sort of, front of mind as much as anything else. Because clearly it's not the only state he could have picked on in this regard.
Exactly. Exactly. I just think it's also interesting that it was this particular issue and not something like immigration or anything else that he's testing the boundaries on that he decided to push.
Yeah, well, that's true too. And there, I mean, she might have given kind of the same answer with regards to obeying the law, but this is an issue. Clearly, again, he was sort of riffing on it, as President Trump tends to do, and sort of bouncing from topic to topic. And this one sort of came up into his mind. He had in his head, "Oh yeah, that's something that's going on in Maine," and it's gone from there. But you're right. I mean, there are clearly going to be various issues on which Governor Mills is very much at odds with the Trump administration.
Although not as much, I mean, not as much as some Democratic governors. She said at the beginning that she wanted to work with the new administration and not be part of the resistance right away.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's right. I think that's a smart move for honestly any governor, but we have a state that clearly has, a fairly substantial uh part. I mean, it's sort of divided geographically, as you well know, but certainly there's support for the president here. She doesn't want to alienate everyone. And honestly, much of what a new administration does is going to be perfectly legal, to the
Yeah.
extent that, there are aspects of the new administration where she may not feel that way. That's going to be a different question. And of course, we've seen, a lot of, I don't know how much you want to get into the Doge stuff, but there are going to be specific impacts on Maine as there have been on other states, and so I suspect there'll be more pushback than she might have hoped she would have done.
Well, I was having this conversation with Professor Mock last week. President Trump has been throwing a lot of things out there trying to expand his powers, and a lot of them are getting challenged legally. But it's really just a lot of things being thrown out there and not necessarily anything unique set of circumstances, really, is it? It's just a lot of things being done at the same time.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, it's been a lot of stuff, and
Yeah.
maybe just some hope that some of it sticks. That there's so much going on that people can't keep up with it. I think it's even over the weekends, your sort of head is spinning from wait, that email from Elon Musk. Oh wait, he's purging the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Oh wait, he's doing this. He's seems to have shifted sides in the Ukraine war. So there's obviously lots going on. I do think there are a couple common themes in terms of what that policy has looked like. One is clearly a pretty strong set of claims about the so-called unitary executive, this idea that the president controls the executive branch. I mean, that's not a brand new idea. Certainly we saw George W. Bush make similar arguments, but he certainly didn't push it as far in terms of
But
practical impact.
and I remember his signing statements when he signed bills.
Yeah, yeah. And those were, as you'll remember, really controversial when he would say, look, my inherent powers say that I can override what Congress is telling me to do. In some ways, that is very similar to what President Trump is doing, but on a wider range of issues and on issues that aren't, within his commander-in-chief authority. Bush was really resting on, the post 9/11 war on terror notion that, we were at war. He had powers that were activated as a result, and that Congress couldn't step on those powers. He certainly felt that he had, authority over the executive branch. He used the phrase unitary executive all the time, but he didn't, make the claim, for example, that he could fire a member of the National Labor Relations Board, because these multi-member regulatory commissions have for 90 years, been protected in the Supreme Court from being directly under presidential control. Their members have terms, they have to be fired for cause if they're going to be fired. President Trump's administration has said, well, no, that's not the way it is. I have complete control over these personnel and I'm going to exercise it. So that's going to be a Supreme Court case, obviously.
Right. I mean, all things are being fought over in the courts, but it's not really a crisis. It's just a lot of things going on, right?
Well, it depends how you define crisis. I think maybe if you want to call it a crisis, it's that, Congress is sort of watching this from the sidelines rather than stepping in. I mean, if you look at the Article 1 powers of Congress, they're substantial, especially with regards to spending, with regards to setting up the bureaucracy. So it's one thing to say, the USAID is a worthless agency. That's a policy question you can argue about. But for whatever worth it has, it was created by Congress in law. It's funded by Congress in law. And the president doesn't have the power to dismantle it or stop spending that was appropriated under the law. So, to the degree that, he is doing just that and Congress isn't doing anything about it, that is a problem for me. I don't know if it's a crisis. I think we'd have to see, as you say, or suggest sort of a lot more substantial resistance by the White House to obeying court orders should these actions be found illegal. I think that's going to be, that's kind of the Rubicon, if you will.
Right.
And we're not there yet, but there have been, there are going to be lots of challenges because these powers have been pushed in ways that are at best aggressive, and I think, in some cases, pretty clearly against the letter of the law. There's a third category where the president has told the attorney general, don't enforce given laws.
Right. It sort of harkens back to what Obama did with DACA a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that at the time, if you'll recall, got a lot of criticism. The
Right?
idea
Oh,
that the
yeah.
president was saying, I don't have to enforce that law. I think it's unconstitutional. He got a lot of pushback, and rightly so, right? Obama certainly pushed on aspects of executive power. So did Biden. But, Trump has sort of taken that and run much farther with it, which, again, these were things that were heavily criticized by especially Republicans, some Democrats. This has become, unfortunately, kind of a polarized issue. But again, those critics are now disturbingly pliant, I think, to this
Well,
this pushing against the boundaries of the Constitution and the law.
I did notice with your bio that you are the Thomas Brackett Reed professor at Bowdoin.
I am.
He must be turning over in his grave watching the Congress do nothing while the president runs amok.
Well, Speaker Reed, you may know, he was, of course, Speaker of the House in the late 19th century, and he was very much against the Spanish-American War, and was unable to convince his caucus that it was a bad idea. We ended up, of course, declaring war on Spain, and he quit, right? Because he felt that he couldn't, you know, take part in an institution that was doing something he felt was wrong. Um, he, of course, had wanted to be president himself and wound up losing the nomination to William McKinley. He had a good line. He said when he didn't get the nomination, he said, well, they could do worse, and they probably will.
Yeah, I think people forget that we actually had a Republican Speaker of the House from Maine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the Republican Party was, a dominant party in the late 19th century, of course, and very dominant in places like Maine. Um, it's been an interesting, obviously, it's a whole nother conversation is to talk about the evolution of the parties for the last 100+ years.
Well, and regardless of party, the legislative branch has always in the past asserted its primacy. Even against their own presidents.
Yeah, well, and that's, part of the framers' vision. You read the Federalist Papers, and you have to come away with this idea that they really expected elected officials, appointed officials for that matter, to really push, fight their corner. And to sort of, the famous phrase from Federalist 51 about ambition counteracting ambition, with legislators understanding what their institutional prerogatives were, pushing back against the president's efforts to expand his own power. They weren't naive people, right? They understood that the president would try to expand his authority, but they also felt that there would be pushback, there'd be deliberation, and if it turned out there was gridlock, well, gridlock was the price you paid for not being able to reach consensus. So, yeah, I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, for example, this is the last time there's a really strong congressional push against the aggregation of presidential powers, right? The pushback against the Vietnam War, both Presidents Johnson and Nixon, pushback, of course, against Watergate. And you have this sort of 10-year period where Congress really tries to deal itself back in to budgeting, to the war powers, to covert action, to executive ethics. They try to figure out a way to set up a mechanism to police executive corruption,
And
all
that's when
these
we got the
ethics laws, privacy laws, civil liberties laws, all that stuff, right, in about a 8 or 10 year period.
and that's when we got the Budgetary Control Act and the Church
Mhm.
Committee and the Gang of Eight overseeing
Yep.
intelligence operations. All that came in that period, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got all these efforts to increase oversight, really, again, for Congress to play an important part. And a lot of them are kind of procedural. And Congress has to step up to the plate and take its part in the procedure. Unfortunately, it hasn't all the time. And, over the last 50 years, we've seen, a lot of erosion of those statutes. Presidents have acted, Congress hasn't pushed back. And so, the stage was sort of set for a president really willing to go, one step further and really push the boundaries of executive authority. Again, the expectation would be that Congress go, yeah, this is kind of a bad idea. We will lose, our very point of existence, for example, if we give away the budget power.
Right.
And yet, we're seeing pretty inconsistent responses so far.
Whatever you think about the underlying issue, it seems like so far with this main issue, they're following the correct procedure and starting the Title IX investigation and doing that first, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would separate out sort of the interpretations of the law that we saw in that argument
Mm-hmm.
from the impoundment argument, from the Doge stuff. I mean, these are, I think, are separate tracks. It's not too shocking that a new administration would come in. They'd have a new interpretation of how they think. We're talking about, Title IX of the Education Amendments back from 1972. That's about sex discrimination in educational settings. And then we've got, of course, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act from 1964, which is also banning discrimination on the basis of sex. There's a 2020 Supreme Court decision authored by Justice Gorsuch, actually, which holds that uh, the being gay or transgender is a protected class under the definition of sex in that context. Now, that was about employment law.
Yeah.
So it's not a direct, something we can exactly transfer over to Title IX. We'll see. I think what it is, the administration's prerogative to try to figure out whether states are implementing, uh, the money that they get from the federal government in accordance with the law. I think the big argument will be about, well, what does the law really say? What does it mean? A presidential executive order doesn't override the law, even if it tries to interpret it. So we'll see, if the president's right. President Trump and Biden can't both be right about what the law said. So somebody's going to have to figure that out.
Well, and so the process will be then Title IX investigation. They find, hi, Mookie. This is Mookie. Title IX investigation. They presumably find Maine guilty of not following the president's directive or interpretation of the statute. Then they decide to withhold funding, probably, as you said, the other day, just federal education funding, right?
I would think it's hard. I mean, there's been sort of, a broad threat. The president was imprecise, I think,
He often,
to know, what he was, did he mean all federal funding for the state of Maine? It would be pretty hard, to make that stick, I think. Does he even mean all education funding including Title I funding and stuff like that? I don't know, honestly. But yeah, that would be the process, right? You'd have a ruling, you'd say you're not in compliance, we're withholding your funding, the state sues, and we see.
and I'm just thinking about how long this could all play out because the state has to pass a budget by June.
Mm,
So if this fight is still going on, and this, I'm going to make this point in my column this week, this is more a political question than a law question.
yeah,
But this fight is still going on by the end of June, or even by middle of May, and it's not settled yet. The administration and the courts could really drag it out and cause havoc with our budget process too.
possible. Yeah, well, that's the federal government when it comes to federalism, its power over the states really comes down to bribery and blackmail in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
We know from past Supreme Court decisions that you cannot commandeer state officials to carry out federal law.
right.
Um, but you can put conditions on money that you give to the states or
Well,
pass through the states.
and that's how we raised the drinking age and the speed limit nationwide.
Yeah. So back in the 80s, right, when they were trying to basically persuade the states to have a 21-year-old drinking age everywhere, they said, well, you don't have to, but if you don't, you won't get any highway aid, right? And every state wanted money for their highways, so they went along, changed their state laws. Interestingly, though, in the first case that came to the Supreme Court about the Affordable Care Act, this was back in 2009, 10. I guess it came to the court maybe in 11. The question that was sort of originally motivating the court was the Affordable Care Act constitutional as a whole, right? About whether you could use the Commerce Clause as a justification for that act. And the court said, well, you can't use the Commerce Clause, but you can use the taxing power. But then the second part of it had to do with the expansion of Medicaid. And the original version of the Affordable Care Act said that every state had to expand their Medicaid program to certain parts of the population. And if they didn't, then they were at risk of losing not just the new Medicaid funding, because this was paid for, at least in the first few years, but you would not only lose that new funding, you would lose your current Medicaid funding, which is I think the technical word is a shit ton of money
Yeah,
for almost every state. So yeah, I mean, so that was in the law, and the states also pushed back at that. They said, it's one thing, not to get the money from expanding, but you can't, punish us for not changing the original program. The rules of the deal here are already in place. And the Supreme Court agreed with that, right? They basically said it was too much to use that funding to, again, bribe/blackmail the states into compliance. So people had thought that sort of drinking age decision, went, sort of the limits of spending, right? That you could sort of use that logic for any kind of conditioning of federal spending, but there are limits according to the court, and it's not clear where those are. Right. We do know that the conditions have to be relevant to the aid that's granted. So that's one reason I think we won't see like farm subsidies or other monies separate from education, play into this. But
I did find it amusing that the investigation in the Maine was done through the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm not quite sure how that's going to fly, but again, is that close enough to this? I don't know if the humane farmers are really involved in anything dealing with the definition of who can play sports.
well, I think it's because UMaine is a land grant university.
Sure. Oh no, there's definitely connections. I mean, they get a lot of money from the federal government as a result.
So that's probably why I went to the ag department. It just sounded strange.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm not sure that part of it will hold up very well. I think the ed department angle is more promising, but again, I think there's a lot of question about whether, is President Trump's interpretation of the law correct as a matter of law? I mean, the politics may play out differently, and that's a different question.
So, I mean, private colleges and universities like Bowdoin get a lot of money from the federal government too, depending on the college. They might have to adjust their policies as well, right?
Yeah, I assume, I mean, I'm not privy to those decisions here. I assume there are some conversations going on, though, about how that's going to work. You know, yeah, I mean, the place like Bowdoin, is not getting as much direct funding, but it's getting money via, federal financial aid programs coming to
Right.
students. It's getting obviously scientific grants and research grants. And there are a whole panoply of separate education department grants that, colleges apply for. Some of them are competitive, some of them are pretty universal. So yeah, there's definitely federal money in pretty much every college and university's budget. So there's a hook there. Again,
Yeah.
whether it can be used as a sledgehammer, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. And again, the part of this is a separate question from, what President Trump raised with Governor Mills, but there was a letter that went out from the Education Department to every institution of higher education about diversity programs, and had a really, really broad reading of the Supreme Court case that struck down affirmative action in college admissions. And sort of talked about that to begin with, but then it talked again very broadly about what it thought, what the author of the letter thought anyway, constituted racial discrimination. Again, I'm not sure that's going to wind up being good law, but it certainly sends a signal, right? And it may have impact in its own right.
So it seems like the administration is definitely pushing this broad unitary executive theory. Do you think the Supreme Court's going to piecemeal it, or are they going to try to come up with a whole new theory of the presidential powers?
Well, that's an excellent question, and if I knew that, I, would be doing better in the political betting markets. Yeah, well, I mean, there's various ways they could go, right? I mean, as recently as 2020, the Supreme Court upheld the distinction between what it called line agencies, like a cabinet department, and in those agencies, the president can basically fire anybody. They serve at the pleasure of the president. Nobody's going to, say that the president can't fire the Secretary of State, for example,
Or even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as he did on
or
Friday?
even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Now, there are limits on who the president is supposed to be able to appoint to that position, according to the Goldwater-Nichols Act back from the 80s. And the president's current choice doesn't seem to meet those qualifications. But yes, president can fire the head of the Joint Chiefs for sure. Um, Now, so the court said that, okay, there are line agencies where you can indeed serve at the pleasure of the president. And then there are independent regulatory commissions, basically. And these are multi-member boards. They were created, a lot of them in the 30s, to deal with the Depression, to add sort of a nonpartisan regulation to a bunch of different markets.
Right.
Labor, the SEC does, securities and exchanges, the FCC does communications, FTC does trade, there are
Or
a number of these. And they
yeah,
were created, they have, depends on the board, they have multiple members. Sometimes those members have to be balanced by partisan affiliation. They have terms that, so that only a couple of them are up at any given time. And most importantly, in statute, they have protection against being dismissed except for cause, right?
right,
And so there was a case about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that was created by Congress in 2010 with a single director, not a board, not a commission, but with these same kind of protections that person could only be fired for cause.
right.
And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't mix and match, right? If you have a single director of an executive agency, they have to serve at the pleasure of the presidency, but you still can have these regulatory commissions, multi-member boards with all the protections that includes. Again, the idea is to literally to buffer these people from the president. That's the entire point, to make them less
Right.
partisan. That's the theory, at least. I mean, sometimes, like with the Federal Election Commission, making them less partisan makes them very ineffective.
Makes it more partisan.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but that's the idea behind them. And the Supreme Court in 2020, a case called Seal of Law, said that was okay. Um, so President Trump, as I mentioned, has now, pushed to this point. He's fired a bunch of folks on independent commissions, most notably maybe this person from the National Labor Relations Board.
Yeah.
And so, he's banking on the Supreme Court saying, well, actually, we don't think there is a buffer possible, that anybody who works in the executive branch has to be able to be removed by the president in order for the president to plausibly manage the executive branch as a whole, right? There's no sort of wiggle room here. Again, that would go against a lot of precedent, and in fact, it would, upend, again, this sort of balance that we've had for almost 100 years. I mean, the original cases dealing with this were 1926 and 1935.
Right.
And again, they've been left largely in place. So, Trump administration is betting on expanding at least that far, right, for the president to control these so-called independent regulatory commissions. I think in a lot of what they're doing, they're actually hoping the Supreme Court would go even further, which is to say that the civil service itself, is an unconstitutional boundary between the president and executive agency staff, right? I mean, because if
Right.
you take the
Have to.
well, I mean, if you take the theory seriously, right, its logic suggests that absolutely no one in the executive branch can be buffered from the president. But of course, if you're a civil servant, you're hired on, what we hope is merit. You have some expertise in the subject matter area, and your protection from that is that you don't, get booted out when the new administration comes in, right? You have, effectively tenure in your job, and so again, you can be fired for extremely poor performance, but the idea is that you are, again, literally buffering people from presidential authority so that you can have a continuous, state of good government. That's the hope. Again, it's not always good government. I'm not going to try to defend every piece of agency performance, but that was the principle, and that goes back to 1883,
Right.
right?
And it was actually a reform that was originally proposed by Republicans.
It was, yeah. Well, this was a big argument actually within the Republican Party back in the 1880s between, the James Garfield wing and the Chester Arthur wing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea was to take away patronage and make it more professional.
Yeah. Well, and that was, we saw in the Civil War, for example, that patronage, literally killed people. You had
Yeah.
terrible people in positions they shouldn't have been in. Even going back to Andrew Jackson's administration, he was a very enthusiastic patronage guy. You had, remember all our income at the time came from tariffs. Basically, there was no income tax yet. So, the guy who ran the Port of New York, was in control of a huge chunk of cash and every once in a while would sail away having stolen it. I mean, it was not exactly ideal. So,
And Jackson, of course, also, blatantly ignored the Supreme Court order. So,
yeah. Well, that's his the statement that's quoted often is at least apocryphal, but certainly he felt that way. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I think you do have an interesting, this long history of, people on both sides of the partisan divide trying to come up with a way of providing good nonpartisan government below the level of political appointments. And then, so Woodrow Wilson argued, right, that politics and administration ought to be separate. And that was a little bit fanciful, but even so, you get the idea. It's so again, the claim of the unitary executive at its strongest would be that any kind of independent agency is illegitimate, including the Fed, by the way.
yeah.
And even the civil service could be unconstitutional. And I don't really think the court will go that far. But that's what's on the table. It's a really big change if it were to go through.
So you think they might just break it down into smaller pieces bit by bit and hamstring some agencies but not others, or limit independent agencies in some ways?
Yeah. So one thing they could do or try to do, I mean, I'm not sure this will work because again, Brett Kavanaugh wrote, I think, the decision in Saylor Law. He's, sort of a disciple of, the late Justice Scalia. And, sort of can look at him as a bellwether, I guess, of unitary executive theory. There is something that he wrote in that decision that, talks about, well, does an agency have a lot of executive power because back in the 1935 decision, they said, well, it has executive power, but it does some work that looks quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial, which is to say that it makes regulations and it also adjudicates individual cases in some case. So if you think of,
Yeah.
the SEC, it's doing all those things. So, the Trump administration is arguing, well, the NLRB, for example, actually is not any of those things except executive. It's only executive, and therefore, we should be able to single that one out. And there's a couple that they mention.
But the NLRB also hears disputes and makes rules, right? So,
Well, they all make a lot of, I mean, there's lots of regulation going on in a lot of agencies, so that doesn't make it in itself
okay.
quasi-legislative, but yeah. Um, the way they go about figuring out the rules though is done, it's argued in a kind of legislative way where they'll have hearings, they'll have proposals, amendments, votes, because they're a commission, right? That's part of
Exactly.
it. So anyway, you could, I don't think it would be very convincing, honestly, as a matter of logic, but I've been unconvinced before by the court's decisions over the years. And so one possibility would be to carve off a couple of the regulatory agencies and say, well, actually, they're more executive, so they don't count. They don't get this, sort of buffering from the president. That's
Case by
possible.
case basis.
You could do that. You could say, well, but the Fed, on the other hand, does other stuff, and this agency does other stuff, so they're still buffered. You could do it case by case, as you say.
Yeah, yeah. So you think, okay. So I've been looking at the various things Trump has been doing and trying to think of basically three different buckets. One, things that are almost certainly legally he can do, but that are getting challenged because there are too many logos, essentially. Or just, too many special interest groups out there don't like what he's doing.
Okay.
The other one is things that are murky, like regulatory agencies that we were just talking about. And the other bucket is things that are completely, clearly unconstitutional or illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of examples for each?
Sure. So on the legal side, I mean, certainly the president has power to, freeze regulations. He's got power probably to order the name, changed on U.S. maps, on government maps anyway, regarding the Gulf of Mexico/America. He has obviously the power to pardon people. And presidents of both parties have used that power unwisely, in my view. But that is their power.
Yeah,
Um, you have, the president does have the power to, set up some of these advising bodies he's created. He has the power to, shift the way information gets to him, the kinds of reports he gets. Certainly has the ability to tell, his agency heads to work on a certain problem that he wants to make that a priority. And so, I mean, remember, an executive order is an order to the executive branch. And so,
exactly.
it can obviously have spillover effects to the general public, but it really is aimed at government policy. And so anything sort of within the executive branch, probably legal. Um, some of the stuff about personnel then gets murky, though, because remember, Congress, as Article 1 of the Constitution, has the power of the purse. They have set up the departments in the first place. They've given them some kind of legal charter and
Right.
told them what they're supposed to do. And so if suddenly the president says, no, I don't really want you to do that anymore. Or, this grant that you've already given, the city of New York has $80 million in its bank account. You can now take it back. That, that strikes me as murky at best, when you sort of verge into, and the Doge question is interesting because, right, it's created by sort of renaming an agency that already existed inside the Office of
Exactly.
Management and Budget and then bringing it into the Executive Office of the President. So far, so good. All right. You could certainly charge that kind of agency with doing figuring out better ways of managing the government, which was what was the original executive order said. Whether you can give that agency the power then to wander through records that might be protected by the Privacy Act or, to actually have power over personnel decisions, that's, again, pretty murky. Even before we get into, collective bargaining agreements and that kind of thing, just the nature of this agency being given authority is odd, especially since Mr. Musk himself is supposedly not the director of this agency.
Yeah, he's a special government employee.
Yeah, he's a special government employee inside the White House. So what is his actual authority over cabinet departments? I mean, he doesn't have any. I mean, the president does,
A
but
bunch of the cabinet heads have told their agencies to ignore that email.
well, that's what happened today. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is an interesting development. So a lot of that stuff is, I think, murky. The I would say there's a few things I would highlight as being, pretty clearly illegal, and I sort of touched on these earlier in some ways. So one is sort of again, dismantling agencies, not
Yeah.
spending money that has been appropriated. Again, there's a way to do that, but you have to pass a law. Um,
Yeah.
there's nothing stopping, Congress, especially or Congress with a Republican majority in both chambers, from passing a law doing what the president wants to do in these areas. They haven't done that. You don't get to do it by fiat. Part two, I think, would be places where the president has told the agencies to do something that is pretty clearly against the text of the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is what comes to mind here. The birthright
Birthright.
citizenship provision of the 14th Amendment really hasn't been much disputed. There's Supreme Court precedent, there's congressional debate around the time of its adoption, makes it very clear what it was meant to do. And again, you may not like what it does, and there is a mechanism, the constitutional amendment process, to change that. But
Yeah.
but again, that's not what's happened. So, again, for the president to issue an executive order, well, that's just, hot air to a degree. What that order purported to do was to tell, agencies not to issue passports or birth certificates, for example, to certain children under the categories that the order decided were not actually citizens. That's where you're going to get into these lawsuits that are already happening. Um, and so I'd be, I think that one, maybe it was only meant as a press release, but at least on the face of it, it does seem to be illegal. And then there are the ones that I touched on before, where the president has told people in the executive branch not to follow the law. Right. Remember that one of the duties of the president in Article 2 of the Constitution is to faithfully execute the law, to take care that the law be faithfully executed. And obviously, there's always a lot of dispute over what faithfully means. Right. That's where we get into the different interpretations of
Exactly.
the law, and that could be perfectly valid.
Going back to the DACA program again.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, the Justice Department under President Obama said that he did have the authority under the Immigration Act to implement DACA. President Trump's Justice Department said no. President Biden said yes. Right? It's clearly something, and same thing with Title IX and Title VI or VII. You can argue about these things, but what has also happened are a couple cases. I can think of three examples where President Trump has directed the Department of Justice or other cabinet agencies not to enforce the law. Straight out, the TikTok ban, of course, being primary. That is a law that was passed by large majorities in Congress, signed by the president, upheld by the Supreme Court as constitutional, not getting implemented because the president's decided he doesn't like it, right? A subsequent president. That, again, is a law that would have to be amended if that's the way you're going to adopt it. You don't get to basically suspend enforcement. Secondly, the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, where it's been illegal in U.S. law for decades for American companies to bribe foreign governments to get business. That too has been set aside. The president has told the attorney general not to enforce it. And then thirdly, we've had a number of regulations that the president has said, well, we need to change these regulations, but in the meantime, you should act as if they were already invalid. Again, there is a process for changing regulations. Every president in the modern era has changed regulations. They've tried to revise them, even cancel them out. But that's not where we've stood so far. You don't get, again, to just say it doesn't count, it doesn't exist until that process has been complied with. So,
And all these things being challenged as well so far.
I think probably. I mean, we've got to wait until you've got to be able to prove noncompliance with a particular regulation.
And standing.
Obviously, for a lawsuit, you need someone to be harmed.
Yeah, that's the issue.
Right? For somebody to actually come to court, somebody has to have standing to sue. Maybe nobody is harmed by the delay in the TikTok ban. I don't know. I mean,
or
according to
the
Congress, national security is being harmed. So,
yeah, yeah.
uh,
But I mean, as we both said earlier, Congress is pretty pliant with everything these days.
they have been so far, for sure.
Mm,
Yeah, and I think that,
yeah,
again, that's probably the thing I think is most disappointing is the unwillingness of Congress to sort of stand up for its own prerogatives. They could do quite a lot, actually.
yeah. I mean, and that's been a trend for decades now.
Yeah.
That's been doing less and less, and letting the president do more and more.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, so, we talk about an imperial presidency, or I certainly do. But, it's worth keeping in mind that some of that power is taken and some is given, right? Congress will delegate power to the president. They'll pass a vague law that a future president will find a loophole in and use it to do something that really wasn't intended. Um, again, Congress always has the power to come back and change those laws. But most fundamentally, right, they in the past have been able to, they've held up nominees, they've defunded certain activities. They've made it clear that unless the executive branch changes its behavior, then the executive won't get what it wants. This time around, that hasn't happened, at least not yet. There's still
But
time, and this is early days, but
going back to Nixon, the only reason he complied with the Supreme Court order to turn over the tapes was because he had no support in Congress anymore.
yeah, I think ultimately, right, he was facing impeachment and removal. Of course, releasing the tapes probably hastened that because once you actually knew what was on those tapes, even his support that remained vanished. But yeah, I think you're right. He saw the writing on the wall.
But it's hard to see
This-
Congress now with the way it's currently made up, standing up to Trump in that way, in anything really.
no, and again, I'm sort of a little bit baffled, a little bit disappointed. I mean, we saw the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, right, say, this is Representative Cole from Oklahoma, who actually, had is not a dumb person, saying, well, appropriations aren't law, which
Yeah,
is
he's
just
been there a long time. Yeah,
that's just false,
I know.
right? It's false.
Yeah,
So, and I don't think Congress should be punting to the courts either. I think this is really something that um, they can take action on. They're not helpless. Chuck Grassley, right, apparently told a town hall meeting. This guy has been in Congress for 50 years, Senator Grassley, in the House and then the Senate. He is president pro tem of the Senate. And for him to say, well, the only thing we can do is complain, that's just not true. And he knows better. And so I'm disappointed. I mean, we are seeing, I guess, some pushback at town meetings, in a
yeah.
number of districts around the country. But again, I'm, my book, The New Imperial Presidency, in the last chapter, which I hope I assigned to you at the time, it says,
Or you did.
it says really, Congress will act when its constituents tell it to act. So that's really, I think, where the power comes from ultimately is going to be from the people of the country.
So you think we can still rely on the courts to sort out all these different acts?
No, I don't actually. I don't think I mean, the courts were not built to sort out political debates like this. I know we complain, on both sides of the political aisle, people complain about the courts being partisan, being too political. But in part, that's because they're being dragged in to settle political questions that, ought to be dealt with by the so-called political branches, the Congress, and the executive. So, I mean, the courts definitely can make some rulings on, where the boundaries are, what a law was supposed to mean, under the best interpretation of the text. They can step in and, limit the executive from overstepping some of these boundaries. They can uphold, with regards to impoundment, the 1974 Impoundment Control Act, for example. And I think that's important. They should do that. But there are places they can't go. Again, the question of standing is one of them. There are procedures. We're seeing, in one case at least, the Public Employees Union, sued, Mr. Musk or some version of Doge. And the court said, well, but there are executive appeals avenues that you should follow before you come to court. Well, that's true and procedurally proper, but those executive avenues have effectively been wiped out by the current administration. So the court is right on the law, but wrong in practice. And I think that often is the case, right? We think, okay, that's right on the law, but it doesn't make much sense.
Right.
Um, and so I just think, the courts are put in a position where they may be judging perfectly correctly. They just don't have, their job is not to police political boundaries. That's the
Exactly.
job of Congress, and I think that's where I want to see action.
Yeah, like I said, that's something that's unfortunately I think, been degrading for decades in both parties.
Oh
Or
yeah. Well, and again, it gets linked into, party polarization, the notion that, well, if a president of my party does that, he's a strong leader. But if a president of your party does that, he's a dictator. And that's been true, as you say, of both parties and their supporters for a little bit too long now.
and that's what worries me as a constitutional conservative about the unitary executive theory is what's the next guy going to do with this? How
Yeah.
far will they go?
Well, there's a great line. This is the Justice Jackson, one of the great Supreme Court justices, Robert Jackson, who was there for a bunch of big cases about presidential power in the 1940s and 50s. And the Korematsu case, right? This is about Japanese American
Yeah.
internment in World War II. And he dissented and he said, look, these kinds of powers are like a loaded weapon. They lie around waiting for somebody else to find them and use them. And so that's, I think, what the threat is, right? It might be that in a particular case, this is a useful power, but you're setting a precedent. You can use it for things that are worse and dangerous. And I agree, this is a great time to be a constitutional conservative. And I think, in a lot of areas where the administration is moving is not really in a conservative direction. This isn't a partisan question so much as one of orientation towards the law and constitution. And I would like to believe that people of all political persuasions, support the rule of law.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court acts in all these different areas.
Yeah, for sure.
Whether, as I said, they take a piecemeal approach or whether they try to usher in some kind of sweeping new vision for their executive.
Yeah, I mean, I'd put my money on piecemeal, but even there, you may find that precedents are set that are problematic.
And even then, a lot of these things will be bogged down in court for a while, which again, to get back to the news from last week, makes me wonder about the Maine education spending and the funding. If that freeze ever is put in place after the investigation, is it going to get resolved quickly enough to be considered for the state budget?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, my assumption is that one way or another, there'll be some kind of temporary order in place, while the merits of the case are being discussed. Um, but that could be, it could be problematic if the legislature goes ahead with a budget um, on the basis that, okay, well, the money, we think it's coming now. It's being, right now until the merits are decided, it's fine. So we're going to pass a budget on the basis that money's coming through. And then, of course, if it doesn't, you're in pretty big trouble.
They're already in trouble.
Well, that says maybe, yeah.
So you think it could take a while to resolve these Title IX investigations in the case?
I assume so, though, to be honest, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, that the administration, I think, has probably kind of made up its mind of what it's going to find with regards to violations there. And I mean, it has a pretty clear position on what it thinks the correct interpretation of the law is there, and Maine's not doing it. So in that sense, it's an easy investigation for them to conduct, which may mean that moves faster than we're speculating here.
If they wanted to move fast,
I suppose that's a good point. Yeah,
and they
but
may want to play it.
maybe. I don't know. That's an interesting point. I think, I mean, if I were them, having decided for whatever reason to pick on Maine, you want then to send a message to the other states, right, who might be in similar positions. So maybe you do want to move fast.
Well, and I think ultimately, if the courts uphold the administration's point of view, or at least their ability to have a point of view, then I think Maine will back down because they're not going to risk education funding over that one issue. It's just
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one because it does go to this, human rights law that Maine passed. So that's makes it politically tricky on the other side as well. But yeah, I mean, what we saw with No Child Left Behind, for example, is a lot of states. This is, I think, maybe it's a slightly different kind of issue, but it dealt with the threat of losing education funding. Right, a lot of states were upset at losing autonomy. This testing regime that was going into place. But in the end, they complied. Angrily sometimes, but they complied because the threat of losing the money was a real threat.
yeah, and that's what I think will ultimately happen here because state of Maine, no state is going to forego all federal education funding.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's possible. I mean, I guess it may depend on how finely you parse that, right? Is it all federal education funding? Is it from a certain program? Is it possible to get it down to an amount that would be symbolically painful, but not, I don't know that both sides are interested in claiming a win here. This may be one of those things that you really do have the desire on both sides for the other side to just flat out lose. And if that's the case, then we're going to come probably to, you know, uh, an ugly situation at some point. But
Yeah.
when I'm not sure.
Well, it'll be interesting to me too, because again, as I said, presumably other states are behaving similarly to Maine right now. So if they start to go after Maine with these investigations, they're going to have to go after other Democratic states as well. That are
Presumably, and I would have to guess. I mean, I haven't looked at. I mean, I imagine you're right that there's definitely a correlation between, the party that has, authority in a given state and this policy, but it's probably not a perfect correlation. So,
no, I mean, I'm sure
doesn't
it's
seem-
be different varied by the state, but I'm sure, for example, I'm just keep bringing up California, but I'm sure California has very similar policies to Maine, and it's just going forward doing what they do.
yeah. Well, that I imagine is the case. So, in California, of course, the president's already, trying to use wildfire aid and disaster relief as leverage there. So it wouldn't be a new, this policy is not immensely new, though. That's again, a different area, though there, one that has been very bipartisan over the years. So
Yeah.
um, again, that falls into, I guess, more of the murky category you were talking about before.
So, is there anything else besides the birthright citizenship issue that you think is a big one that's definitely illegal that'll be struck down by the courts?
Well, again, these issues of enforcement, I think, are important. And it may come down to the regulatory side. I think the impoundment will be struck down by the courts. The administration is claiming that the president has this constitutional right not to spend money that Congress has appropriated. But that's an argument that Nixon made nearly word for word, and he lost. Right? It had been a settled question for about 50 years, both because of the law and because of the Supreme Court. Right? In 1975, they basically ruled against Nixon on this same case. So I
But they're
don't think there's been a big shift. Even conservative members of the court have tended to be pretty not idealistic, but expansive about the Congress's power of the purse. That's a very different, if we're going to be gung ho for a unitary executive, then we kind of have to be gung ho for an Article One that maintains its own prerogatives too, and the power of the purse is central to that.
well, right. You can't say that the president has all this power and Congress has none.
Right.
Yeah, they both have a lot of power, but you can't say that only one branch has power. That undermines the entire framing of the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, and of course we've seen, the White House tweet out. I don't know. What do you do now? You don't tweet.
I
But
don't
you X out. That seems wrong too. But
know.
anyway, yeah, I mean the whole idea that you are sending out pictures of the president as a king and bragging about it, that's just weird to me, right? I mean,
It's weird, but
you may not be old enough for Schoolhouse Rock, but I am. There was a whole cartoon, No More Kings. It's the whole point of the American Revolution. Why would you be pretending or you know, bragging about the president being a king? That's just not American political culture. So
that's power, but it's just harmless. It's not an action.
I guess, I mean, no, it's not illegal, right?
Yeah.
The White House press secretary has right to send out fake covers of Time magazine with King Trump on it. That's okay. It's just weird. And, just, again, contradictory to, the heart of what, another executive order that the president did put out was about patriotic education. I would
You know,
suggest patriotic education involves reading the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and reading Article One, especially.
great. Then he should follow it.
Yeah, I'm all for the White House reading Article One. Yeah. They can
Everyone,
read Article Two as well. Article Three, all the way to seven, read the amendments. 14.
but it is worth pointing out that Congress comes first for a reason.
Oh, it absolutely does.
I
Yeah.
mean,
It
it's
was,
always been a point that people make sort of glibly, but it is also very much true. Framers did that on purpose.
no, I think that's absolutely accurate.
So, and really, again, the speaker whose namesake position you hold made Congress even more powerful, and he would just be rolling over in his grave at how powerful the president has gotten.
Yeah, remember this is Boss Reed, Czar Reed, sometimes he was called, because he actually tried to make Congress work. I think Speaker Johnson does not have the same level of political dexterity, I think, that Speaker Reed had in terms of getting, the Republican caucus to act coherently. Uh,
No, and with this slim a majority, it's going to be tough for them to get anything done.
Well, it is. And I think that's one reason you're seeing so much action on the executive side. In part, right, if you act in an executive, aggressively using executive action, what you really want is for Congress to do nothing. So you're banking on the fact that Congress is, incapable of responding. And if that's true, then, the sort of executive takes a step, nobody pushes back, takes another step. It's sort of a ratchet effect.
And if the courts agree with you and expand your powers even more, then it doesn't really matter who wins midterms.
Well, I suppose that's true, but again, I don't think that they would agree on questions so fundamental to Article 1 as the spending power, especially.
I
So,
tend to agree. Yeah.
if you can stop there from being again, the case where, but again, you don't even have to go to court for Congress to, ought to want to defend itself institutionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the problem, not just with the Congress being in the same party as the president, but with the president getting so much more powerful each and every time.
Yeah, no, I think, so I mean, I've often talked about the presidency as sort of a punctuated equilibrium. You're at a level for a while and then something happens, and then you rise in authority. And that's been, occasionally there's sort of a backlash and the president will lose power. But on the whole, it's been sort of an upward trajectory. What's interesting, you see, the Civil War, Depression / World War II, even the War on Terror. Those are events you can kind of understand as to why they might, accrue more power to the executive. I'm not sure what the crisis really is supposed to be right now that's caused this. Um, Obviously there's, plenty of polarization, plenty of anger, there's sort of this aggregate notion of, um, about backlash to globalization and sort of, demographic change in the country. And I do understand that, but it's different, I think, than the kinds of events that have pushed presidential power further in the past.
Right. It's the only crisis is the lack of Congress to be able to govern at all.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts?
No, we've covered a lot of ground. This has been a good conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me, Andrew. It's good to see you again.
A pleasure. Yeah,
We
well,
should
let's
keep doing
grab a
this.
good Maine beverage at some point soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Thanks. Have a good one.